To the world, he's an example of Wall Street success, a man who manages billions like they are mere pennies.
Prosecutors say Madoff told employees Wednesday that the business had been insolvent for years, losing at least $50 billion, and was, in his words, a giant Ponzi scheme.
Shortly before sentencing Monday, the 71-year-old disgraced financier apologized to his family and victims. Madoff said he'll live with the torment for the rest of his life. He also said he dug himself deeper into a hole as the scheme progressed.
He has absolutely no remorse.
That he never sees the light of day. As I said, I have nothing else to say about him.
Trust, betrayal, pure evil.
A man who maintains an aura of utmost respect, and a man who had single-handedly scammed Wall Street out of $65 billion. Bernard Madoff, a renowned financier and former chairman of NASDAQ, thought he was untouchable until on the crisp morning of the 11th of December, 2008. A knock at his door changed everything. The visitors are FBI agents. They're here to reveal a hidden truth that's been lurking behind Madoff's pristine image for decades.
According to civil and criminal complaints, Madoff confessed he had been cheating investors for years, and he estimated his total losses from the fraud may have been $50 billion.
The father said of his investment firm, quote, "It's just a big lie. It was basically a giant Ponzi scheme."
The entire financial world will be shaken by the revelations that follow. The extent of Madoff's fraud is unlike anything seen before. Over $65 billion vanished, and so begins one of the largest and most notorious investment fraud cases in history, the story of the Monster of Wall Street. In the early 1960s, a young Bernard Lawrence Madoff steps into the world of finance, founding Bernard Madoff Investment Securities. With his charm and business acumen, he quickly gains a reputation, attracting investors who believe he has an almost mystical touch. Madoff promises high and steady returns, and for decades, it seems as though he can deliver them. The financial world admires him. He becomes a former chairman of NASDAQ, a Wall Street legend, known for consistently outsmarting the markets. His client list grows to include celebrities, charities, and powerful institutions who trust him with their fortunes. But behind the scenes, Madoff's success isn't what it seems. From the very beginning, Madoff runs a secretive operation. Rather than investing his clients' money, he is running a Ponzi scheme, taking money from new investors to pay returns to earlier ones. A key factor in the scheme's longevity is Madoff's focus on charity investments, which, due to a federal 5% payout rule, creates a manageable withdrawal rate, allowing Madoff to sustain his Ponzi scheme for decades without attracting attention. While most Ponzi schemes offer high returns and collapse quickly, Madoff's operation appears stable, providing modest but steady returns around 10% annually, which appeal to investors' fear of market volatility. Many believe that by limiting gains, Madoff's approach is conservative and safe. His reputation as a modest, successful Jewish philanthropist helps him build trust within Jewish communities and exclusive circles, a tactic known as affinity fraud. The illusion of stability and profit continues to snowball, protected by Madoff's carefully constructed image. He isolates the business within his firm, keeping operations confined to a few trusted employees on a secluded floor. This elite group crafts fake documents and records to keep up appearances, while Madoff remains the only person who fully understands the scope of the scheme. The scheme grows to monstrous proportions, draining billions from unwitting clients, yet incredibly it goes unnoticed by regulators and auditors, at least until one man begins to question the legend of Bernie Madoff.
It took me 5 minutes to know that it was a fraud. It took me another almost 4 hours of mathematical modeling to prove that it was a fraud.
In the late 1990s, Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst and expert in securities, catches wind of Madoff's unusually consistent returns.
What were the things that caught your attention?
It was the performance line. As we know, that markets go up and down.
It began a decade ago when Markopoulos was working for a Boston investment firm.
And his only went up. He had very few down months. Only 4% of the months were down months. And that would be equivalent to a baseball player in the major leagues batting .960 for a year.
So either way, he was doing something illegal.
Either way, I knew he was going to go to prison.
Markopoulos knows enough about the market to suspect that Madoff's success is not only improbable, but mathematically impossible. Over the years, Harry Markopoulos compiles evidence and repeatedly alerts the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. But each time, his warnings are ignored or dismissed because of the lack of sufficient evidence. Markopoulos tirelessly raises alarms, publishing reports, and reaching out to anyone who will listen. Yet Madoff's fraud remains undetected. He goes above and beyond and provides a detailed analysis with 30 red flags, arguing that Madoff's returns are statistically impossible. Despite submitting a 17-page memo titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud," his repeated warnings go unheeded. The SEC, blinded by Madoff's impeccable reputation, fails to act on the information, unwittingly allowing the scheme to continue. Then, the financial crisis of 2008 strikes. The economy is in turmoil, and clients start demanding their money back. For Madoff, the walls are closing in. He realizes that he can no longer maintain the facade. On one fateful evening, he confesses to his two sons, Mark and Andrew, that the entire business is one big lie. The sons report their father to federal authorities.
And the decision to turn him in, how did that evolve?
Well, we knew right away that that was our only course of action.
You called the FBI, or the lawyer called the FBI?
It was later that day. Marty London, who's the gentleman who was helping us, Mark's father-in-law, brought in some of his colleagues. They told us what the proper course of action was in terms of who to call and how this thing is handled, because we just didn't know that. And we made the decision to make the phone call.
What was your reaction when you heard him, that it was the boys who turned the father in?
I realized they had to do it. I wasn't angry at them. Of course they had to do it.
It is December 11th, 2008, when agents arrive at Madoff's Manhattan penthouse. The man who once stood at the pinnacle of Wall Street is taken into custody. The arrest shatters the lives of Madoff's clients, many of whom lose their life savings. Thousands of individuals, charities, pension funds, and banks are hit hard. The public watches in horror as the details of Madoff's scheme unfold, and the financial world is forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. A revered financier has betrayed everyone. Ultimately, he pleads guilty to 11 federal felonies, and Judge Denny Chin sentences him to 150 years in prison, denouncing Madoff's actions as extraordinarily evil.
10 of Madoff's victims asked to testify here at the sentencing. Many of them have emotional stories to tell, such as how they trusted him with their savings and lost it all. Bernie Madoff was sentenced to 150 years behind bars, the maximum sentence for one of the biggest swindles of all times. Madoff also had a chance to speak. His lawyer said he'd talk about the shame and acknowledge the pain he had caused.
I was in the process of retiring. In fact, it would have been around now I was going to retire. There's no retirement for me.
However, in this crowd, there isn't much sympathy, and the list of victims is huge, with little hope of recovering any significant portion of their wealth.
Meanwhile, Madoff's family faces a separate kind of fallout. Mark Madoff, Bernie's elder son, is consumed with guilt and shame, haunted by the accusations and lawsuits that pile up against him. On December 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest, Mark life, unable to bear the weight of his family's disgrace.
The story of Wall Street swindler Bernie Madoff took a grim and tragic turn this weekend. Police found his older son, Mark, dead in his New York apartment on Saturday.
Andrew Madoff, the younger son, tries to distance himself from the scandal, but his health deteriorates under the strain and he succumbs to cancer in 2014.
Police said Mark Madoff committed suicide by hanging himself on the 2-year anniversary of his father's arrest.
His grotesque ego permitted only one sentence of apology to his son Andrew, but allowed him to write letter after letter to a stranger to try to manage his legacy.
And he sent a letter to Andy and his fiancée partner, "I'm so sorry, Dad."
That's chilling.
It illuminates a narcissist that is compelled to rationalize what he happened.
Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife, loses nearly everything. She tries to rebuild a quiet life, but is haunted by the loss of her family's wealth, status, and dignity. As she steps away from the limelight, Ruth faces the world alone, leaving behind her husband and children. And the series of tragic losses due to Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme continues. On December 23, 2008, René Thierry Magon de la Villouche, co-founder of Access International Advisors, is found dead in his New York office. His wrist is slit, and he has taken sleeping pills. A note arrives for his brother, expressing deep regret for the financial devastation his clients face. Despite his innocence in the scheme, guilt consumes him. The fallout does not end with the Madoff family and thousands of other victims. The SEC and other regulatory bodies are forced to confront their own failures. For years, they ignored the red flags raised by people like Harry Markopolos, who had tirelessly worked to expose Madoff's fraud. Within the industry, Irving Picard, a court-appointed trustee, begins the arduous process of recovering stolen funds. His mission is to claw back as much money as possible from Madoff's net winners, those who profited from the scheme, so that he can redistribute it among the victims. The legal battles stretch on for years, with Picard eventually recovering billions, though it's only a fraction of the $65 billion that Madoff's clients believed they had invested. The restitution process is complicated, painful, and often slow, leaving many victims struggling to rebuild their lives from scratch. As the narrative circles back to Bernie Madoff, now confined in prison, he becomes a horrific shadow of the charismatic financier he once was. His health deteriorates, and he spends his final years isolated from the world he once dominated. On April 14, 2021, he dies in prison at the age of 82, his life ending in stark contrast to the luxuries he once enjoyed. The Madoff story leaves behind a legacy of betrayal, pain, and vital lessons for the financial world. Though the monster of Wall Street is gone, one question remains. Bernard Madoff did not execute the $65 billion fraud entirely by himself. He had allies, and these accomplices, some may call them murderers, still walk Wall Street freely to this day.